Hello, this is Jim James, author of the book Automatic Poker. This is a video that's going to cover c-betting and barreling, most specifically focusing on barreling. This is something that a lot of players have problems with, myself included, deciding which boards, which hands, against which opponents to fire a second barrel as a bluff. Obviously, if your hand is for value, it's pretty straightforward. Usually you're betting. But there are times that you'll get to the turn after bluffing the flop and you'll still have air, or your hand will have improved in some way, or a multitude of situations can arise. And navigating those spots can be fairly tricky. So this video is going to serve basically as a guide to help you better approach and make better decisions on the turn. So what I pulled up is a few hands from my database in which I was faced with the opportunity to barrel the turn, and I'll just run through these hand examples and tell you my thought processes. And I'll also give you an easy to follow two-step process to follow that will help you as a default in these situations. Keep in mind that most of these decisions will be in a vacuum. In other words, readless. Obviously, the opponent you're facing can cause you to tweak the process you use to make your decisions one way or the other. So I'll try and go through some of those reads, but just keep in mind that these rules are not necessarily hard and fast. They can change depending on who you're facing at the table. First example, I pick up ace-jack offsuit in the hijack, and I open and get flatted by the button, so I'm playing out of position. And the flop comes 10-8-4. This is one of those situations where you might consider checking back if you were in position, because this board does connect with a good amount of my opponent's range for flatting. And a lot of the hands that don't connect will still float the flop and put me in a tough situation on the turn. With that being said, I do have overs. I have a backdoor straight draw, and a lot of times he's going to have hands that are overcards that may not float, and he'll have hands that might still fold to this bet, small pocket pairs. So I think betting is definitely better than checking. And obviously, if we face a raise, we have to fold. And he does call. Now the turn is a 3 of clubs, which is a pretty big brick. Any hand that he called the flop with is probably not going to fold to a barrel. A good majority of his range that called the flop will probably continue on this turn. So that makes this a bad card for us to barrel in that sense. Equity-wise, our hand is not that great now. We have potentially 6 live outs. That gives us around 13% equity, which is not that great. There's a small chance our hand is ahead right now if he has a straight draw. But he has so much equity against our hand, and the fact that we have no fold equity and we're going to be put in a lot of tough river spots makes this in my opinion, a bad spot to fire the turn. So just briefly going into that two-step process I just did, what I like to first look at is my equity, because that's usually the most important thing in deciding whether to barrel or not. So step one, I just look at my equity, which, as we just stated, is not that great. So by check folding this turn, we're not giving up too much equity, and sometimes we'll just be completely crushed here. So even some of our outs may not be live here. The jack may not be live if he has a certain straight draw, mainly 9-7. So that's the first step of the process. Second, how likely is our c-bet to work? What's our fold equity here? And we already discussed that first. We have poor fold equity. So there's two things going against us. We have low equity, and we have absolutely almost no fold equity. So both those factors combined together obviously makes this a check versus a bet. We do check, and he checks behind. Board pairs tens on the river. Um, a lot of his made hands we would expect to bet the turn. Eights, anything with a 10. Sometimes pocket sevens, nines, something in that range. So when we get to this river and he didn't bet the turn, a lot of the times he's going to have something like Queen Jack, which I would expect to bet some of the time. Just random overs, 4x hand, which is unlikely considering we flatted our under the gun raise. He'll have twos, fives, even threes, which we would expect to bet most of the time. And perhaps maybe some weak made hands. So when we check here, which I think is best, I don't think we're going to get any of his made hands to fold. The only thing we're folding here on the river when we bet is hands that we're beating anyways a lot of the time. And a lot of those hands will not fold on this board anyway. Since the board paired, he's going to expect any 8, any 4 to be good here. Even ace queen or ace king, if he didn't randomly show up with those hands, is good against our hand and might call. So we check, he checks behind. This would have been a spot where we might consider calling if he was to bet here. Because most players don't go for thin value. Most 8s were going to bet the turn anyways. And he's probably not going to bet a 4, and he probably would have bet the turn with a 10 or raised the flop. So this would be a pretty good spot to call because he's probably going to show up with a draw if he bets this river. But he checks behind, and we scoop the pot, and he had a gut shot on the flop. So actually a double gutter. No, just a gut shot. So yeah, that was a good example of he may have folded that turn if we had bet, and he would have folded the river, but we're beating him anyways. And if he had bet the river with that hand, obviously we could have called and took the pot down as well. So next hand we're going to look at is I raised Jack 10 suited, and it was under the gun. Get flatted by the cutoff seat. And I just flopped Gen. Royal flush draw. Never folding this flop. Obviously this flop pretty much plays itself. We're just going to bet and stack off. And probably stack off the turn too, depending on what comes. So we bet the flop big. I figure this is a bad flop. Either he's going to like this flop or he's not. There's not many hands that are going to float this flop. Ace high boards are pretty much the ultimate scare card board. So I go ahead and bet big because if he has an ace, he's calling. If he doesn't have an ace, he's not calling. That's pretty much my thinking. I mean, obviously king queen might call a smaller bet or something like that, but even though we do have this monster draw, we still don't have a made hand yet. So fold equity, if we can make him fold on the flop, it's still a good thing for us, especially if he could fold a better hand, like king queen. And obviously, I didn't intentionally pick this hand on my database because I made a royal flush. And I actually don't even remember making this royal flush. I was probably playing like 10 tables, and you know, obviously I've played long enough that a royal flush doesn't excite me anymore. No big hand excites me, so it's cool to make this, and it has nothing to do really with this hand. I'm just showing you an example of playing the turn when you make a big hand. People's first inclination on this turn might be to check, but obviously this is the ultimate scare card, so we're going to be expected to check if we just made a big hand. So I think our best play here is just to stick it in. He's probably going to call with an ace because, I mean, that's what people do. They don't fold to scare cards, especially after he called such a big flop bet. I mean, we have less than a pot size bet behind anyways. There's no point in checking here and letting another spade peel off or another scare card for him. He's probably not folding an ace anyways. So that's most likely the majority of his range. So I think just shoving it in and giving him a chance just to call it off. But I do check anyways, which I think is a mistake. But yeah. But luckily a harmless 7 peels off and we can just shove and expect to get called by an ace. And, strange enough, we actually made a mistake on the turn, but came out smelling like a rose because he looks us up with second pair after every draw in the world comes in. Yeah, he's not even beating a lot of our kings there. So, and if we shove the turn, he might fold. So I'm kind of glad that I made a mistake there. But it's really hard to misplay a royal flush. So maybe that's a bad example. But yeah, moving on to the next hand, I pick up 9-4 offsuit in the small blind, and min raise, get called. His range is very wide here in the big blind, so I c-bet just about 100% in this situation, expecting it to be a plus EV play. But in this instance, I do get floated. I turn a pair, which increases my equity. So when we go through this two-step process I was talking about, one, did my equity improve? And the answer is yes. I'm now beating all of his twos. Have a draw to 2 pair. I'm beating all of his draws that didn't raise the flop for some reason. And I'm even beating his ace highs, other random hands that might just floated there. So checking here would be a mistake because it's hard to check call this board. So obviously we have to bet something. And did this card help our opponent's range? Well, potentially, but not likely. Is it a scare card for him? No. So that's kind of a neutral situation, is the second facet that we were talking about earlier when you're doing the two-step process. So 1, our equity did improve. That makes it a bet. 2, not really a scare card, so it's not really that much of a bet. But the fact that we're blind versus blind and we could have the best hand right now also kind of figures in here. So I think we definitely bet. So I bet half pot, get called again. The river is definitely a scare card for our opponent. So if he did have something like a 6, we might be able to get him off that hand. And our equity definitely did not improve. This is the river, so our equities are set. So I'm not really worried about him calling me with a draw anymore. So on the other hand, if I bet, he's going to fold all of his draws that he had on the turn. There's not that many made hands in his range now because 8s are mostly raising me, 6s might raise me. The only thing really in his range that he might have here that's a made hand is a deuce, a random 4 that had a straight draw on the flop, and ace highs. Might potentially make a hero call here, but there's not that many made hands that I'm going to make fold, is what is my point here. So that makes us kind of turning our hand into a bluff if I bet. So, but I do think there's several hands in his range that might bet if I check. All of his straight draws, flush draws that missed, ace high floats, whatever, random junk. So if I check here, I can call most bets. But he checks behind and ended up having showdown value with a deuce. So we'll go on to the next hand. Ace 10 offsuit. I raise in the hijack and get flatted by the button. We have ace high. It could be the best hand. This isn't the best board in the world as far as raw percentages, as far as c-bet success. But when we're out of position, it forces you kind of to play aggressively. So I think in a vacuum, this is definitely a bet. Unless I knew for certain that he was never folding here, or was a really aggressive player that floated a lot, then I could probably just check fold. But yeah, I think in a vacuum against most players, you pretty much are forced to bet here because I think it's much more profitable than checking. So I do bet and get called. Turn is probably the best card in the deck for us because it gives us top pair, but it's not an ace. An ace would be a scare card for him, 10 not so much. So our hand definitely turned into a value hand. Our equity improved, obviously that makes this a bet. And in fact, our hand's a value hand, that makes this a bet. It's not that big of a scare card for him, but it is an overcard, so it potentially could be a scare card for him, so that makes this a bet. But we really don't have to worry about fold equity too much now, since we now have a made hand and a strong hand. So I think this definitely makes this a barrel. If you're going to barrel arrow, you definitely got to bet when you make top pair as well. So I do that. I follow up with a bet. I get called. The river is the king of diamonds, which is a scare card for him. Not really so much for us because there's not that many kings in his range unless it was two pair. And those hands are sometimes going to raise the flop anyways. So not that many kings in his range. So I'm not really worried about our hand not being good right now. It's just a matter of whether we can get, if it's better to bet and get value from nines, stubborn 9-8 or something to call the flop, ace-9, whatever he could have here. Or is it better to check and let him bet all of his misdraws? And I think he probably has more misdraws in his range than he does made hands. So I think it's pretty close. I think it probably either way is fine. But actually probably like a check call here. But yeah, I guess it doesn't really matter. I go ahead and make a really small bet. I guess I'm maybe trying to induce a bluff from a misdraw, which is fine. Just depends on this player, the read I have, and I don't remember what read I had on this player at this time. This is played on Bovada, and a lot of times I don't have any read, but potentially I had a read that he was aggressive and might raise. And also it might get some kind of crazy value from, I don't know, ace-6, a 4. A lot of hands that might not have called a big bet on the river or a shove might just call this bet. So actually I don't mind this so much. It's a little unorthodox, but it's fine. And he does call, and he had a middle pair on the flop, which probably would have folded. So I feel like we maximized pretty good on that flop. So let's move on to the next hand. In this hand, I raise 7-5 suited in the hijack and get flatted by the button. Flop a gut shot with a backdoor flush draw, which makes this a good spot to c-bet just based on our equity standpoint. And he, as far as equity, obviously a gut shot's not that big of a deal, but the gut shot straight draw does add another out basically to us. So, 20% of the time or so here, we're gonna make a good hand by the river, strong nut hand. So that's definitely, we want to be able to realize that equity. And if we check, obviously, where our hand is not strong enough to call. So in that case, that makes this a bet. And just the fact that generally people fold often enough to make a flop c-bet profitable. So yeah, this is definitely a bet in those two cases. So I do bet and get floated. The turn is a brick. So our equity has not improved. And actually it's a lot worse. We still have potentially 8 outs. I'm sorry, we potentially have 4 outs. So we're going to make a straight, 9% of the time on the river card. But considering that he did call the flop, there's going to be some flush draws in his range. So 2 of our outs are dirty. So actually 1 of our outs is dirty. So our equity is definitely diminished on this turn card. That in the second facet, our turn, that turn card does not act as a scare card to his range. So pretty much anything he called the flop with is pretty much going to call the turn. So I think this is just a check fold. He checks behind though, and we get to the river, and the ultimate scare card comes. So unless he had an ace-high flush draw or some other hand with an ace that was a float, he's not going to like this card too much. Probably not getting him off 10s, but a lot of his mid-pocket pairs, small pocket pairs, and all of his draws, which a lot of those are beating us at this point, may fold the river. So we're not getting his entire range to fold, but I think we're getting enough of his range to lay it down that I think a bet here is definitely profitable. It doesn't have to be a big bet either. Anywhere between anywhere between half pot and $2 would be a good bet here. So I go on the smaller side just basically to get rid of the draws in his range. By betting a little bit smaller here, I potentially gave him the call with a 6x hand, but I'm truthfully on Bovada poker here, and that hand's probably calling anyways, even a bigger bet. So I like the smaller bet just to get his draws gone and hit maybe a few pocket pairs. He does fold. Next hand I have Queen 4 suited on the button and get flatted by the big blind. Our equity is not that great on this board. We do have backdoor flushes and straight draws, and we have an overcard to the board. That doesn't really make it that great of a equity situation for us. And this board is extremely drawy, so we don't have that much fold equity here. But I do think we have enough that it makes us either a neutral EV or slightly plus EV play to c-bet here. So I think betting is definitely better than checking. There's a lot of good cards that could come on the turn. For example, any 8, any heart, any jack, any queen, any king, any ace, we can bet the turn. So I think that makes this a good spot to c-bet. However, the turn is a brick. And once again, with the theme, our equity did not improve, and it's not likely a scare card for him. Our fold equity is not improved, so I think this is just a check behind. And we do make a 4 on the river, but I think, yeah, it's still a tough call on the river. He is going to have some busted draws in his range, but there's no busted flush draws. It's all busted straight draws. So I don't, depending on his bet size, I don't think we're beating enough bluffs to make this a call if he bets. So I think, but we can check behind now with our showdown value, and he did have ace-3 and we won the pot. Raised 10-9 suited in the hijack, flatted by the button and the big blind. We flopped a fairly nice hand for our nice board for our hand. We have open-ended straight draw. Some of our outs are dirty, and there's a lot of draws in our opponent's ranges. So our equity is good, so that makes this a bet. However, the board is also good for at least one of our opponent's ranges. It's going to connect in some way. So we have low fold equity here. And the fact that it is a 3-way pot gives us really fold equity as well. Which puts us in kind of a difficult spot because we're not in position. So if we check here, if it checks through to us and we check and the button bets, it's depending on what he bets, it's going to be a pretty difficult call. Check shoving is an option, but there's a ton of hands that will call us on this board, so we have a little fold equity there. So I think probably the play here is to check and just call a street and see what happens on the turn, rather than leading out and putting to a decision, being put to a decision. But I do bet, which is fine as well. We do have potentially 8 outs, as well as our 2 overcards, which could potentially be 6 more outs. It's not really the best board I would like to stack off on right here. But yeah, betting is fine. I actually think checking is better, but yeah, it gives us a chance to take the pot down right now. Now the turn is a 2. Our equity does not improve. Our hand is not destroyed because it's not a club, obviously. But we do have 1 less street to make our hand now, so our equity is diminished, and that's not really going to be too big of a scare card for our opponent's range. So I think if it checks to us, it's definitely a check behind, and then just make a decision on what to do on the river. But we actually hit Jen on the river, and if this had been another brick and it checked to us, I imagine it would be a bet because we have 10 high and there are some busted draws in his range. But the fact that we made the nuts, obviously we want to kind of play this like we have a missed hand, make our hand look like a bluff. So what's the best way to do that? We can either bet really small or really big. But obviously we have to bet because we have the nuts. So yeah, so anywhere between $2 and $3, half pot would be fine, or something like $7 or $8 would actually be really good here, I think. But he does lead into us for pot, which is a really, really good situation, which means he probably has a slow played set, 2-pair, a river 2-pair, some kind of nut hand, or he has nothing but air and it's just a bluff. But I mean, obviously we just shove all in here, and turns out he looks like he was bluffing. So our check behind on the turn induced a bluff from him on the river, which is also a good result. But conversely, if we had bricked off on the river here, would we have been profit? Would it have been a profitable bluff shove on the river had he led and we had bricked off? And that's an interesting scenario. We won't go through it right now. But also, just to talk about what we had on the turn, we had our 2 overcards that we could have called this bet with, and of course the 8 straight outs that we could have called a bet with. So we had 8, 11, 14. We had like a 30% chance of making a hand we could call this river bet with, or shove all over it with, shove all in over it with. So yeah, so checking behind allowed us to realize our equity. And if we had checked the turn and he had shoved all, I mean, if we had bet the turn and he had shoved all in, that would have been a really crappy spot, and we probably would have just folded. So I'm fine with the way I played that hand. Raise Queen 10 offsuit, which is a little loose under the gun, but it's fine. There's probably a read I had on a player that was a huge fish in the blinds. I just wanted to play pot swing. Gets flatted by the big blind. It checks to me. Equity-wise, I do have a gut shot. I don't have any overcards to the board, but this is a pretty good board to c-bet. I have a high amount of fold equity here. It's a king-high board. So with those 2 things in mind, decent equity, I have a draw to the nuts, and the fact that I have high fold equity make this a definite c-bet. So I do that. I get flatted. I turn the nuts, which is always a good situation. And he checks to me again. Obviously, this is a card I have to bet. He could still be on a flush draw. And I want to bet enough to be able to set myself up for a shove on the river. So I think anywhere between $4 and $5 is probably best here. Maybe 6 at the most. 6 might be a little big. 5 gives me $11 behind, and the pot will be something like 19 on the river, which means if he had a king, somehow had a king on the flop, it gives him really good odds to call my river shove. So he checks the turn. I bet 450, which I really like the bet sizing. It's exactly half pot. It sets up something like a 65% shove on the river if he calls, which he does, and it's small enough that it can keep some of his draws in as well. The river's a really good card because if he did somehow have 9x, he might talk himself into a hero call now, if he checks, which he doesn't. And he obviously has a king. He's never folding either, and but it looks like he leads for half pot, which is really fishy. So I think either he has the nuts or nothing here. So either has a king he didn't raise the flop for some reason, or he made a boat, which would be really gross, but that's highly unlikely. He's going to raise the flop most of the time with sets. So I expect him to have something like some kind of random king. I mean, even a hand as strong as ace-king, which is unlikely since he called pre-flop, but not completely out of the realm of question here. He'll have busted draws as well, which is fine. He just bet my entire stack basically with a busted draw, which is a pretty big mistake. maybe wasn't paying attention to stack sizes, but the fact that he is betting almost my entire stack makes me think probably he has more value hands than he does bluffs. So I'm guessing this is probably a 9 that thinks he's good, which is kind of thin but possible. Maybe he just knows maybe he knows he's calling with a 9, but he just wants to make me somehow check behind a king, thinking I might be up against the. I don't know what his thinking could be here, but this really looks just like a king to me. Looks like he had a weak king that just made trips in the river. Now he thinks he's good, or some kind of king, or maybe ace jack. I don't know. It's hard to put him on too many value hands here, but regardless, I'm obviously not folding, and I think with the board pairing, I probably can just call, because although he's going to probably call with all his kings. I think it really doesn't matter. I'm probably sticking it in is the best play here, and I do that. And not sure what he had. He actually had ace king with a nut flush draw on the flop. So I hit a little 2-outer on him. He misplayed his hand. He should have been raising pre-flop, and even if he's slow playing for some reason out of position, he hit the perfect flop for his hand, and to not raise that flop was a pretty big error, in my opinion. So it's kind of a cooler for him though, because he has so much equity on the flop. It's tough for him to raise. I can actually see why he was trying to trap me. But not raising the turn was also a pretty big error. So regardless of that, let's move on to, I think, what is the last hand I've got here. Raise king queen suited on the button. And get a very good board to see bet. I expect to take this down like 65-70% of the time against most players. Even against calling stations, I'll get them to fold quite a bit, because bad players always think that their opponent has an ace. So I just bet half pot and get floated. Get a really good turn card for my hand. However, most of his range for calling the flop is going to be like a weak ace, and getting him off that hand is not going to be that easy. I mean, it is 100 NL on Bovada, so the player pool's pretty weak on average here. I'm not going to lay down too many aces for 2 bets. As far as that goes, I don't have much fold equity. My equity is strong though, but I still don't have a made hand, and I don't really need to build the pot too much, because if he leads on the river, I can still shove if I make my hand pretty comfortably. And if he checks the river, I expect to still get my 2 streets out of his ace. The only potential value I'm missing is if I don't bet the turn and can't get it all in by the river, and he would have called with a weaker ace. But that's not really too important of a consideration. The fact that I have no fold equity here and don't have a made hand, obviously if he check raises me here, I'm in a tough spot and I kind of have to call it off. So it's just setting me up for like a worst case scenario mistake on my part by betting here. So I actually like to check behind and just realize my equity. There's even a chance my hand is good here if he had something like 6-7. But I do hit the flush on the river. And he leads into me, which kind of makes his hand look like a weak ace that's protecting or block betting. And obviously I'm going to raise. I could jam there, but there's a potential he potentially folds an ace if I do that. So I expect him to re-raise all of his nut hands here anyway, so I'm not really worried about getting him to... I'm not really worried about... the hands I'm trying to keep in are the ones that are going to fold to a jam. The hands that aren't folding to a jam are folding to any bet, and the ones that are nut hands are probably reshoving over me anyways. So I think I get the most value by doing this small re-raise. And he just calls and had ace-4. So whether he calls a shove with ace-4, it's actually... sometimes he will, sometimes he won't, but I think the majority of players will probably shove there because he's not beating anything. If he was a huge station at fish, I think it would have been a mistake not to jam there, but I'm not sure what my read was at this point. So that's it. That's all the hands I have to show you. Just to recap, what I showed you in this video was a two-step process to go through in deciding whether or not to c-bet and barrel. And just to recap, the first thing you look at, it doesn't really matter the order you look at it, but I always look at my equity first, because that's usually the biggest indicator of whether you should bet or barrel or not. If your equity is good or has improved, and improved being the operative word, then you should lean towards a bet. The second thing is if your opponent isn't going to like the turn card for barreling, or is it going to like the fold. In other words, if isn't going to like the flop. If you're on the if it's not a turn situation, if it's just a regular flop c-bet. So fold equity. So basically, 1, how's my equity? 2, how's my fold equity? Those are the two things you should ask. If both are going for you, it's likely a bet. If both are against you, it's likely a check or a fold. And if one is positive and one is negative, then you kind of have to weigh the strength of one or the other. If your equity is super strong, it might be a bet, but your fold equity is super low. It might go the other way. So just kind of weigh those factors. And the last thing you have to do, obviously, is look at your opponent type. And maybe I'll do another video of looking at opponent types to see how you adjust beyond the two-step process that I just went through. But if you just follow those 2 steps, you'll be on the path to making much better flop and turn decisions as far as c-betting. Thanks everybody for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment or email me at jim@automaticpoker.com. Feel free to join the forum. Go to automaticpoker.com and you'll see a link there for it. My blog's there as well. I wrote an article on c-betting recently and adjusting the player types. And that might be the next step for you to go. If you want to go ahead and just read that article, it'll probably answer most of your questions regarding to those adjustments that need to be made. But yeah, if you see any errors in this video or anything you don't agree with, feel free to comment. I'll be glad to answer. It's something I'm still working through myself. This is an ongoing process. But this is some things that I have learned over time that I think will help your average player improve his or her c-betting game. Thanks again for watching, and I hope everybody has a good day. We'll talk to you later.